Okay. Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you a woman who's been quite significant in my own spiritual search, a woman of, many would call her a polymath, but also the first notated woman composer the first notated composer in Europe. So I hope that you will meet her through what I have to say about her. She lived from 1098 to 1179, a mystic, a composer, and a physician, writing on theology, healing, music, and on the saints. A huge amount of books she wrote, and there you see her with the visionary, the traditional representation of the visionary experience as fire coming from heaven, and she's writing on a tablet of some kind. We don't quite know how. And on the other side of the wall, you see her faithful priest, sort of servant, Volmar, who is busy taking down from dictation what she is hearing. The visions appear to be both moving images with speaking and music in them. It's how she describes the visions. I see things by means of my soul, for I do not hear with my outer ears, nor by the reasonings of my heart, nor do I perceive by any collation of my five senses, but directly into my soul, with my exterior eyes wide open. I never fall into weakness of ecstasy, but have visions while awake, both day and night. She appears to have had those from the age of 3. And at the age of 7, she was oblated to the abbey. I imagine that her merchant mother and father were not entirely sorry to hand a visionary child over to the monks at the Disibodenberg. There she is again, and that's another picture from Scivias, her book, and so on. Her music is written in the neumes which characterize the age. I can't sing very much of it. I'm going to give you a little taste. This is the beginning of her hymn to the spirit, O Ignus Spiritus. I'm going to sing the opening line in Latin first. They're all in Latin, but I'm then going to sing it in an English translation, and so on. There are 77 songs in a morality play with music. Oh, fiery spirit, our comforter. Oh, Ignus Spiritus Paracliti, life of the life of all this created. Holy you are in giving life to all. Holy in anointing the seriously broken. Holy in cleansing the weeping infected wounds. It's only a tiny bit. You often hear them sung very high. We actually have no idea what pitch they were sung at. And her nuns would have been selected not for their singing voices, but for their vocation, although they would have sung together 7 or 8 times a day. So that's the music written in the style of the time, a single unaccompanied voice. Her approach, looking at her interfaith in an age which was actually often regarded as anti-Semitic, as she does in her visions receive this figure of synagoga, the Jewish tradition, and she sees the Jewish tradition, here is synagoga, holding all the prophets in her pocket and her heart, in order to pass it over. There they are, the patriarchs and prophets in her pocket. And she hands them over, as you can see, to a figure called Ecclesia. She is the church, and she's holding, you'll notice that some of the figures are red. Virginity was very important to her. Those red figures are the virgins. There they are close to. So you see saints and virgins and priests in Ecclesia's chest. There you see Ecclesia with all these people living in her, and the sort of organ pipe motif collecting her to heaven. Often people see her view of creation, which sees everything as infused with the power of God, the animating power. They see her as ahead of her time, but she lived in a time when the prevailing medical view was that drawing on Hippocrates and made more contemporary by Galen. This saw the world as having 4 elements, which was the basis of the theory of medicine and later used for psychology, typology of the 4 humors. Each of the humors associated with various correspondences, particular physical and mental characteristics, and combined with complex personality types. It's a classification of types of personality, but also of types of people. So each person is seen as either being earthy or fiery or watery and so on. There are the 4 humors, airy, associated there, fire, earth, and water. Some of those descriptors that we have there, we don't know what they were. We don't know what black she meant by black bile. But you see the hot, cold, wet, and dry are part of the scheme by which the middle-aged medicine worked. And here's the doctrine of the humors. The humor, the temper, the personality type, melancholic, associated with a particular organ, the spleen, and nature, cold, dry, and the element as earth. Now, if you're going to prescribe in this medicine, first of all, you have to look at the nature of the person in front of you, what they are, what their humor is. Then you have to look at the weather. So a watery person on a wet day would be in their chosen element, whereas an airy person on a wet day would not. So which herbs you advise them are dependent on the relationship between the person and the environment at the time. It seems to me a very subtle way of prescribing. I'm not sure many of our GPs today would look at the weather in order to decide what they would prescribe. 4 humors should be in balance. Too much or too little causes disease. We need to rebalance the humors and so on. Here we see some of the Elizabethan descriptors. They were well in place there. Choleric, you see some of the characteristic ambition, aggression, prone to deep and sudden depression, mood swings. The sanguine, impulsive, fond of social gatherings, very creative, but sometimes late and forgetful. Those are just 2 of them. Eysenck picked this up in 1958 when he did his personality typology, but he did it for personality rather than in the same, with the Hildegard one, it's the entire body which is filled with it, not just the personality. Some of you will see that it does resemble the Ayurvedic classifications, the Vata, Pitta, and Kapha classifications. And if any of you have done an Ayurvedic assessment, you'll find that you will be told which of those is dominant and which one is out of balance. So in this particular system, we see that human beings are not separate from the natural world. They're inextricably bound up with the natural world at the physical level as well as at every other level. So we have a system which does not see human beings as resting on the earth, but as part of the whole cosmos. And here we see her connectedness. Air flows freely, serves every part of creation. It's its real duty and function. And so the notion that is quite useful for us today, that however many borders we set up, the air from Africa takes only about 3 weeks to get to us. This is her cosmology, divine ideas in the eternal, in the mind of God and body, the world, soul, the deep resonance of macrocosm with microcosm, the firm hope of access to God through human rationalism and virtue. Virtue is very important to her. Virtue is a product of balance. And deep in her thinking, no tree blooms without greening power. Was greening power a word that she may well have created called viriditas? So the greening power that greens the trees and the grass greens us too. We may like to, as some people have, make it the immune system. No stone is without moisture, no creature without its own power. So every creature, including stones, what we might call inanimate, have their own character. So in the hymn to the Spirit, which you heard the very beginning of, she says, from you the stones take their character. So everything is animate. The division of the universe into animate and inanimate has not yet happened. That was part of the so-called Enlightenment, which some of us would call the Endarkenment. And here we see the armies of marvelous voices singing the wonders that God has created. And her basic view is that God wonderfully formed and ordered creation. And that what happens is that we put cuts into the order, and then the order has to be restored in some way. For her, that was done quite often by singing. And so by singing together, we create order. Here we see her model, perhaps the most significant model of the cosmos. We see the head, the divine head, and then the head of the, perhaps of the Son, of the Christ figure. And then we see the world as the body of God. We see the human being in the middle, but the human being inextricably bound up with, we can see a circle of waters, we can see the air blowing in, we can see the brown earth in the middle and the fire on the outside. We see her signature at the bottom, which is her drawing, receiving that vision. Shows the God, the Father, who bears the great wheel of creation in his breast, supported and embraced by the figure of flaming love, the Spirit. In the middle of the universal will stands a human being, projecting beyond the tiny earth into the realms of universal forces with their various elements and rays. The human figure seems to hold the universal network or system in its hands, thus accepting humanity's task of creative commitment to the world. Here's another similar vision, a circular one, with human beings there, a circle of life, sowing, reaping, and generally tending it. But we see again the image of the elements coming in on all sides. The cosmos as a network of interrelationships within the energy of God, portrayed here as an enclosing fire. The interdependence between God and the world, a mutuality of relationship. Both creator and creation are in a relationship of mutual love. This interpretation suggests there is a creative will that generated the universe using the energy of the Spirit, the wisdom of the Son, Sophia being wisdom, and the infinity of the Father, creator, and is continually working within it, making all things new. Love is being continually worked out in relation to creation and the universe. So creation is not a one-off place, but is continually going on, and everything is in the process of trying to create right relationship. This links with some contemporary theologians. We are asked whether we need to re-mythologize the gospel for our time, the metaphor of the world as God's body, rather than as the king's realm. When the world is viewed as God's body, that body includes more than just Christians and more than just human beings. So that view of the world sees a much more inclusive view of God's work and the nature of the cosmos as including everything. Nothing is excluded from God. So just as the creator loves the creation, so does the creation love the creator. Creation was designed to be beautifully enriched, lavished, richly endowed with the love of the creator. The whole world has been hugged by this kiss. And here we see the perhaps most famous view of the Trinity, with the figure of Jesus, Sophia in the middle. And then we see the Spirit and the creator and the Spirit around that. Other people like to use that as a mandala, and the notion of imagining oneself in the middle of the Trinity. But you see that from the central figure in blue, there is an opening of the fontanelle, the last bit of us that shuts after birth, out into the wider cosmos. So the notion of sitting there and thinking of that upper part of the head opening up into the divine and into the cosmic divine. So we have the notion that of process philosophy, that the whole world is in process. Creative freedom is co-creative. And that's what we're doing in our interfaith group, and the way that John and Bruce, what was described. We're constantly creating something new. We're asked to create new relationships, make existing relationships new. wisdom was very central to her. This figure down the bottom here, a three-winged figure, which she sees. And she sees the first planting of the green seed of the patriarchs and prophets. So she sees wisdom first emerging in the Hebrew scriptures, and then graced with the dazzling virginity of the Virgin Mary, who was a very important figure to her, perhaps replacing the mother who she lost at 7 when oblated to the abbey. Next, with the solid and ruddy faith of the martyrs, and finally with the brilliant and light-filled love of contemplation, by which God and neighbors ought to be loved through the heat of the Holy Spirit. So we incarnate wisdom by the act of contemplation. She, which is wisdom, will go on this way until the end of the world, and her warning will not cease, but will flow out always as long as the world endures. So she sees wisdom as continually flowing through the entire cosmos. And from wisdom, she breaks wisdom down in the light of some of the writings in the Hebrew scriptures into a number of different virtues. Here we see the virtues circling there. And central to those virtues was love, caritas. The strengthening love is blooming in everything, at her most excellent in the deeps and the rising stars and the most fascinating heart of all things, because she has embraced the highest sovereign in peace. And there is the figure of caritas. That is one of the recordings that I love, Sequentia's recordings of her music. Caritas and these feminine virtues and wisdom, all feminine, show that she kept the feminine and the maleness of God in some sort of balance in her thinking. Here we have Barbara Newman, one of the Hildegard scholars, where the feminine presides, God stoops to humanity and humanity aspires to God. A more linear understanding of salvation history, cast in the form of narrative, beginning with creation and fall, culminating in death, the death and resurrection of Christ, and concluding with the last judgment. The feminine designation, on the other hand, evokes God's interactions with the cosmos, insofar as they are timeless and or perpetually repeated. So we have a much more ongoing process-based model rather than the narrative model. And music plays its part in this. It's the echo and glory of heaven, and echoing that glory and beauty carries human praise back to heaven. Music expresses the unity of the world as God first made it, and the unity which is restored through repentance and reconciliation. At the end of her life, she disobeyed the edict of the local priests, and she buried a man who she considered had repented, but they did consider he hadn't repented in the grounds of her convent. And but the letter she writes, well, the result of that is that she's not allowed to sing anymore or to receive communion. So in effect, she's excommunicated in her 80s for standing up for what she believes to be right. The letter she writes to the clerics says, those who silence the music of God on earth will have no part of the song of the angels in heaven. And then the interdict is lifted and she's allowed to sing again. For most of her life, she sits in an interesting place with regard to the authorities. She's originally oblated as a child in the care of Jutta, who was an anchorite on the edge of the Abbey of Disibodenberg. This would have given her an education better than most women of her day, but also freed her up from constant childbirth. But she wouldn't have had the formal education of a boy, but she had acquired Latin. She always said she was uneducated. Her Latin is not as polished as some, and her hymns are not as shaped as people like her contemporary Abelard would have shaped them. But it's nonetheless perfectly understandable, the Latin. And the task of Volmar, who's to write them down, was to simply make the Latin a bit better. It was not to change anything that she said. Indeed, got into trouble when he did. In the end, she attracts a great number of people around her. The abbot of Disibodenberg will not allow her to have any more land. And so she ups with all her followers, and they go to the Rhine, where she builds her convent on a mountain which she dedicates to St. Rupert, the Rupertsberg. And there she sits for the rest of her life. She is allowed to preach. She goes up and down the Rhine preaching, because the Pope affirms her visions, which is quite remarkable for that age. So in singing, we incarnate God. That particular picture is the image of the current Abtei St. Hildegard, which is in Eibingen on the other side of the Rhine. She did cross the Rhine from time to time for another community on the other side. And she talks of music. The hymn, words of a hymn represent the body, while the melody represents the soul. Words represent humanity, melody represents divinity. Thus, in the beautiful hymn, in which words and melody are perfectly matched, body and soul, humanity and divinity are brought into unity. This is her thinking that she always wants to bring to reconcile the dualisms which we've developed. She sits very powerfully in our contemporary search for spirituality. She has a number of the trends that we see in our search, the presence of the feminine, the acknowledgement of the ecology of the cosmos, the notion of the stars and the moon and the earth, all in some connected scheme. So many people have found in her a way of revitalizing current Christianity, as well as people outside of Christianity seeing her discovering the feminine, the wisdom aspect of God. So what we see in her basically making her visions, the material she uses are vellum, but also she uses silver in the visions, although she would have supervised her nuns painting them. Unfortunately, the original of the visions are lost, and they were sent away from Germany in the last war and never recovered. But she did apparently have a way of mixing silver in for the light of the visions that she saw to make them glow without the silver tarnishing. And it's a real shame that the originals are lost. All we have is a very beautiful copy made at the beginning of the 20th century. They express in everything this love and interconnection. And in all of her thinking, there's a circularity, a notion of constant returning and so on, rather than linear. And she's an interesting woman. She has a community of women who, of course, were not in positions of authority in that period. They couldn't be professor, they couldn't be priest, but she would, as an abbess, have had an authority that very few women would have now. But also she developed her own internal way because she invented her own linguae nota, known only to her and her nuns. And we see some of the words which we can't translate because we don't know what they meant. And she did manage to stay within the church, although in many ways she criticized the church. She criticized the priests for having a cloak and a tunic when their parishioners had none. So she told them that they should give their tunic to their people who needed it. So she was quite critical of the church. And she wrote a letter to the Pope and said, remember that you're Pope and therefore you shouldn't be doing this. I think that was about the Crusades, one of the Crusades. This is my diagram of the spiritual experience in music. To have that spiritual experience, we need to be able to relate to the materials, the sound of the voices or the instruments. We need to be in tune with the expression of it. We need to be able to understand or to grasp the construction. And we need to understand the values. And then we can be taken into another place, a cosmic space, by the music. And many people are taken to that space by listening for long periods to Hildegard's music. Here we see the space that music can take us to. This is describing a sitar recital. And we see how music might be able to do this where music can't. It is a person approaching the sitar, which he didn't know. And we see how he gradually gets drawn into music. After some time, insidiously, the music began to reach me. Little by little, all my senses, it seemed, were becoming transfixed. Once held by these soft but powerful sounds, I was irresistibly drawn into a new world of musical shapes and colors. It almost felt as if the musicians were playing me rather than their instruments, and soon I too was clapping and gasping with everyone else. I was unaware of time, unaware of anything other than music. Then it was over. But it was, I am sure, the beginning of a profound admiration that I shall always have for an art form that has been until recently totally alien to me. How far Hildegard saw music as being able to take us into this liminal space, I suspect that's underneath the idea that music can put together things which have been fragmented. And I've explored that in my own music. The arts can sharpen the vision, quicken the intellect, preserve the memory, activate the conscience, enhance the understanding, and refresh the language. So music for me and for Hildegard was an important rebalancing force. And my colleague, Helen Kettleborough, in a book that I wrote on the experience of music and ecology, saw that if we look at that model of there's the music in the middle with the gray circles, which can take us into this spiritual realm, which then can take us into a planetary realm and a cosmos, a cosmic realm. So we can be taken out of the dualisms and the separations of ordinary everyday life as we see it here. We can be taken out into a realm where all is one and we feel at one with everything. And paradox, things which don't apparently fit together, can be fitted together, or we're not worried about fitting them together. We can accept them. And that, I think, for me, is a wonderful model of music, which is shared with Hildegard. This is perhaps, if we look at that, similar to the previous slide, there's the slide, is the cosmic egg. This is perhaps one of the most reproduced of her visions, and it's perhaps one of the most difficult to understand. In her visionary experiences in her book Scivias, where the visions, we have the pictures, and then we have initially a description of the picture, and then we have a 10-page exposition of what she thinks the theology of the picture is. This one remains one of the most complex ones. The world as a cosmic egg. We can see things that we sort of recognize in there. We can see a moon, we can see stars. Stars were very important. Those stars which characterize a lot of the pictures have led some people like Sachs, Oliver Sachs, in his book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, has a very short essay on Hildegard, where he sees that her visionary experiences might have been the result of migraine of some kind or other. But what is often not quoted from Oliver Sachs is that this does not negate what she was given. So you'll often hear it said, well, of course, they were only migraine. Sachs says quite clearly, and those of us who are Christian would say that a God can speak through the woundedness of humankind. And so you see the star motifs, but on the other hand, the stars were extremely important in Middle Age, in the cosmology of Middle Ages, where astronomy and astrology were much more fused than we have them now, and are fused in other traditions. If we take the story of the wise men coming to Jesus, they probably were astrologers and so on. So we have all of that belief system, and which we've separated out. Or it's alive and well in the New Age and its various manifestations. Astrology, people are going back now to reading things like the tarot cards and looking at all of that. So in the spiritual search in general, the notion of the significance of the stars for humankind is rising again in quite remarkable ways if you plumb the internet. This is the interpretation of it. And here we see a cosmic interpretation of it with the outer planets, the inner planets, the south, and you see the terrestrial world in the middle with the representation of air, fire, and water. And we see hail and lightning. We see all of the natural elements there, the sun, and so on. We see the lucidus ignis, which is on the outside, the dazzling light, which always characterized her visionary experiences. So that's one interpretation of a very, very, very complex vision there. And I think I want to go back to that, the notion of the egg, which for me, I think is probably, and this particular drawing from Richard Rohr is one that's very significant for me in the area of interreligious dialogue. So we see there an egg with 3 circles. At the bottom, there's my story, just me, private, small life, searching for significance through power, prestige, and possessions. In my case, that's me brought up as an Anglican in the New Forest with the village tradition of Protestantism, not too high, not too low. And then trekking through a number of different faith traditions and so on, including the New Age and shamanism and so on, and Druidism and paganism alongside the so-called great faiths. That's my story. It's a little story and a big story. I'm now an Anglican priest, and I belong to an our story, which is Christian, and in that respect, a Protestant Christian, although embracing a variety of traditions, group identities, loyalties that expand our own sense of self. But beyond that our story is the story of what is, the great patterns that are always true, and saves us from the illusions and the smallness of both me and our story. So I think that Richard Raw drawing of the cosmic egg, drawing on the work of Chilton Pearce, is one that we need to look at, and may well be in that Hildegard image, the notion of the inclusive nature and where we sit in that, the whole scheme of things, which is not to mistake our story for the whole story. And religions have traditionally, I think, mistaken their individual bit of the story for the whole story. People try to find an identity in a group, an institutional affiliation, a nation, a public cause, or today, like never before, public fame or infamy. People feel protected inside of the group identity or public fame. We all connect with one group or another, a Catholic, a Harley-Davidson owner, a Chicago Cubs fan, and then we sport proud signs about who we are. Such group symbols, flags, and patriotism remind us that we are not alone, and such shared meaning gives consolation and security to the small self and something to talk about. The handy language of us versus them lifts some real burden from our private striving, and there is true comfort in being among our own. In fact, our story feels so sacred that most religion works at this level as a belonging system more than a search for intimacy with God. I think that's a very powerful statement. Works at making our story the whole story, and loses sight of a search for the divine in the midst of being encompassed in a story. The second dome becomes an avoidance of the third and most all-inclusive, to go back to there. So if we get stuck in our story, then we tend to ignore the story, the whole story. And I've been very influenced by John Tavener in doing this interpretation. John Tavener, who some of you will know, started off life as a Presbyterian, became a Roman Catholic, and ended up as a Russian Orthodox and then a Greek Orthodox, and has in his house in Dorset an Orthodox chapel. He did, towards the end of his life, write a piece called The Beautiful Names, which took the 99 names of Allah and set them as a commission from Prince Charles in Westminster Cathedral. The headlines went, John Tavener becomes a Muslim. He was furious about this because he said, I will never become a Muslim. I have my story, and in a sense, I have our story, but that does not invalidate the story. It doesn't mean that I can't see the beauty of the 99 names of Allah, or the beauty of the shaman's drum, which hangs in his house, or the goddesses of Hinduism. When I went to see him, he'd be sitting there with a bit of the Bhagavad Gita saying, June, do you think this is like the Holy Spirit? And we'd sit there looking. So the notion that we need to keep all of those 3 stories, my story, our story, but don't let our story to eclipse the story, which is totally inclusive. The cosmic egg is actually something that's common, as you can see, for many, many mythologies and faiths. Here you see numerous versions of them in various mythologies. Of course, the egg is a wonderful symbol. It is a symbol of fertility, the symbol of new life, and so on and so forth. The symbol, to a certain extent, of rebirth. I love the egg of chaos. So to go back to that egg and the fertility of it all, this is her hymn to the Virgin, and the Virgin Mary in many ways became that cosmic mother for her. It probably became a personal mother. She writes some of her most beautiful hymns to the Virgin, and this is one of them. And for her, you see, she's a branch of greatness, greenness. Mary, you answer some of the unchanging, uncertain questions the saints have been asking. Well, I would submit that a lot of people are asking questions about the feminine and God and the way that Christianity in particular has treated it. The uncertain questions the saints have been asking. And when the time comes for your branches to produce fragrant blossoms, Mary, may you be worshipped, for the warmth of the sun is distilled in you like the perfume of balsam. So we see that notion of bringing everything together, the sun and the scent of the balsam. For in you is growing a fair flower that released fine perfume to all aromatic herbs, which once had been arid, referring to, we see Jesus in her womb. And all this could be seen by everyone, so rich and full was your greening. There's that greening, the greening power of fertility. Therefore the skies dropped gentle dew on rolling meadows, and all the earth was filled with laughter joy, since from your innermost being the fields of wheat came springing up, and because all the birds of the air have tended nests safely inside you. And from then on there was food for human beings, the pleasure of great feasts and banqueting halls. So so there's the notion of the feast, and so on. But in that particular writing is not unlike a mother goddess writing. Therefore, O lovely Virgin, there can be no ending to joy in you. All of these things were despised by Eve, but today there is praising on high. She delighted in the Latin. Some of you will know that the Ave of the Virgin Mary, if you turn it round, the Latin is Ava. So Ava, who in Christian thinking got it wrong, is corrected by Mary, Ave. So we see that, and we see the two women meeting above, Eve with her apple and Mary with her pregnancy, and so on. And here to end with really the power of wisdom, which she sees is circling and encircling all things, embracing everything in a way that brings life into being, for you have three wings. And the three wings, I think, are quite important. We often think of two wings, you know, the heavenly and the earthly. One of them, she says, reaches highest heaven, and another is sweating in the earth, and the third is flying everywhere. Therefore, it is right to give you praise, O Sophia Wisdom. So we have got a divine within us. We have got the earthly within us. But the dilemma for human beings will always remain how to keep body and soul together, how to keep the earthly and the heavenly in some sort of relationship, in some sort of balance. And that's the third wing. In a sense, in all our dialogue with people who are different from us, although they may appear as different, there's a third wing that is flying everywhere, that is holding us together in some miraculous way. Therefore, it is right to give you praise, O Sophia Wisdom. And some people, indeed Hildegard, saw Jesus as the incarnation of wisdom, and Mary as incarnating that. And in her vision of the divine, when she puts her songs, or somebody helps her put her songs together in a collection at the end of her life, she puts God the Creator, then the Virgin Mary and Jesus in the middle, and then the Holy Spirit, and then the angels, and then the saints. The second collection was obviously somebody tried to correct it and took the Virgin Mary out of the middle and put her in with the saints, which is where she belongs in traditional theology, but not popular theology. I think that she tried in the middle, as most of the faiths do in some way, to bring together the male and the female by the use of wisdom. And wisdom is always manifested by virtuous living. I love it that the fact her greatest theology of wisdom is set out in her morality play with music, which she possibly wrote for the opening of the convent on the Rupertsberg. And that's all about the virtues. All the virtues are there. The soul decides to go off with the devil, who speaks because he's not connected to God. And so if you only speak, you're not connected with God. You need to sing to be connected with the divine. And then the virtues spend the rest of the time trying to sort out how they're going to get the soul back in some way. And so her theology of how the virtues all fit together to make wisdom is expressed in this amazing piece. The first piece of that kind, like a mini opera, really, written, I think, for her nuns, because each virtue comes on and sings, I am victory, and this is what I do. I am love, and this is what I do. I am charity. I am chastity, and this is what I do. And then they sink back into the chorus. Hildegard almost certainly played the part of the soul herself, which is the biggest part in it. So thank you for your attention. I have written, I didn't put the book there on Hildegard, a book on Hildegard called, there it is, The Creative Spirit, Harmonious Living with Hildegard of Bingen. Thank you very much for your mindfulness.